Yes, thank you for that, Scott. I appreciate it. And with that, I would like to introduce our wonderful speakers today. We're so grateful to have all of you here. First, we have Professor Kurt Lash, is the E. Claiborne Robbins Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Richmond. He teaches and writes about constitutional law. In 2021, he published the Reconstruction Amendments, the Essential Documents, a two-volume collection of the original documents relating to the framing and ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Professor.
Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone. It is such a thrill to be here, and a thrill to see my friends who I met just earlier this summer at Oxford. And what you're about to hear in terms of the Quill Project and the kinds of materials that you can use to study and research these incredibly important amendments is just far beyond anything that I was able to use when I first became a researcher. And it's absolutely thrilling to have a chance to introduce the real stars of the show. The thing you need to know, there's so many thrilling things about these colleagues, but one of the coolest thing is that Dr. Cole at Pembroke College currently occupies the office that Tolkien had when he was there. So Lord of the Ring fans, you know, this guy, he's got it. Yeah, he'll set up photo opportunities if you go there. So, you know, it's available. I'm just here to set the stage. I'll try to get out of the way as quickly as possible. Nicholas Cole, Kiana McAllister, and Erica Croft, and also with the assistance of Scott Paul, the team here at UVU, and also the team at Oxford. Again, they've just raised computer-assisted research of American constitutional law, just amazingly beyond anything that I grew up with. I'm old school, so I'm in the library. I grew up, looking for old books. Researchers today still, use books every now and then, but more and more they're using computer-assisted research. You're using right now. I'm sure all of you are using, or at least many of you are using computer-assisted research. And what they've done in the Quill Project is they've made it available for you to investigate historical documents and not just see what's inside them, and that's absolutely important. They're going to give you the ability to see history developing on the page. It's called visualized data and data visualization. And it's extraordinary because it's going to change the way you think about American history, and it's going to change the kind of projects that you ultimately decide to explore. So they're letting me kind of set the stage, but really, that project is just incredibly exciting. I want to talk a little bit about the materials that they're engaging, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And these are the so-called Reconstruction Amendments. And they're called that because they were added immediately after the Civil War, during the period that is often referred to as Reconstruction. And you probably have read books on Reconstruction. You may have studied it just to some degree, but it's generally viewed as a period of time after the Civil War, when the Union Army occupied the former rebel states, and Congress was endeavoring to pass statutes to secure a degree of equal rights for Black Americans in the southern states. And that period of Reconstruction is often viewed as ending around 1877, when the Republicans in Congress agreed to withdraw the military from the southern states in exchange for Democratic support of the new Republican president. And with the withdrawal of the Union troops, Black civil rights in the South just faded into non-existence, and really doesn't become a serious issue of equal racial equality until you get into the 20th century and into the civil rights era. So scholars who talk about Reconstruction, that large period of about 12 years, generally view that period as ending in failure with the withdrawal of the Union troops. What I want to talk about today, and what the Quill Project focuses on, is something that I call constitutional Reconstruction. This involves a shorter period. It's about a 5-year period immediately after the Civil War, when the United States engaged in an extraordinary ongoing debate about the need to change, to alter, to reconstruct the American Constitution in the aftermath of the Civil War. This Reconstruction was a success. This gave us the 13th Amendment, the abolition of slavery, the 14th Amendment, the creation and establishment of the rights of national citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which erased the color bar from the right to vote. Building these amendments was an extraordinary project, and it's one that almost didn't happen. And that's an important part of the story. The 13th Amendment, when the House first voted on whether or not to abolish slavery in 1864, the vote failed. The individual sections of the 14th Amendment were first presented as individual constitutional amendments, and every one of them failed. The 15th Amendment almost didn't get passed at all due to the chaos in Congress at the time that they were framing it. And if Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had had their way, ratification of that amendment would have failed. It's quite possible, if you put yourself back into the historical period, at the time that all of this was happening, there was no reason for you to think that we were going to end with 3 new amendments to the Constitution. We might only get 2. We might have only gotten 1. We might have gotten none at all. And it was only due to the extraordinary efforts of Americans, white and black, men and women, who involved themselves to the last effort, and some to their own death in their service in the Union Army. Only because of their efforts that we actually successfully completed constitutional reconstruction and received the 3 amendments that are so important to American liberty today. Now, what I want to talk about, and again, I want to get as quickly as possible to questions and answers, but I want to talk about the attention that Americans focused on the creation of the constitutional text that ultimately became these particular amendments. Getting an amendment into the Constitution is extremely difficult. The process is laid out in Article 5 of the Constitution, and it takes 2 rounds of voting, and it's not ordinary voting. Before you can even propose a constitutional amendment, you have to get 2/3 support of both houses of Congress. And that only gets the proposal on the table. Before it actually becomes a part of the Constitution, it has to go through a second round of voting. And this time, you have to get 3/4 agreement of every state in the Union. This supermajoritarian process allows a minority to block a proposed amendment at every step in the way. There must be extraordinarily deep and broad consensus across both houses of Congress and the country itself, or the amendment will never succeed. And that need for supermajoritarian consent does not advantage amendments with simple, vague language, with ideas of high principle that maybe later politicians will work out down the road. Quite the opposite. The greater the possibility that a vague text might be manipulated by courts or later Congresses, the stronger the argument that the minority has that that amendment should not be passed at all. The only way you're going to successfully get an amendment framed and passed is if you've used clear language and you've communicated an idea that is clearly supported by both houses of Congress and ultimately will be agreed to by the country as a whole. So historians who claim that the framers of the Reconstruction Amendments intentionally produced a vague and ambiguous text seem to have missed the days, the weeks, and the months of congressional debate over the precise wording of the amendments, with key players at every moment threatening to and sometimes succeeding in derailing the process due to their concerns about the text. And the seriousness of purpose and attentiveness to the language that was being proposed was a concern that went far beyond the halls of Congress. When we engaged in this grand national debate, it was very different than the debate that got us our original Constitution. Some of you know this, that original Philadelphia Constitution was secret. The people didn't know what went on at that convention until decades later, like 1840, down the road when Madison's notes were eventually published. When Congress was debating the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, or the 14th Amendment with national citizenship, or giving Black Americans the right to vote, all of this took place in the public and in the public eye with public input. National, regional, and local newspapers had reporters who were actually in Congress at the time They recorded the debates, they published them in their newspapers. Newspaper editors then commented on those debates, published their comments, and then those comments were sent back to members in Congress where they affected, in some cases, the actual course of debate. So the information was actually a two-way street between the people in Congress and the people outside of Congress. And the voices who could comment on what were happening were not simply privileged white male property owners. At the time of Reconstruction, you had the civil rights newspapers, you had the women's rights newspapers of the Revolution, you had abolitionist newspapers, the Liberator, you had Black civil rights newspapers like Frederick Douglass's newspapers. All of these voices were attentive to what was happening in Congress and were commenting on a daily basis and giving their input in terms of what they would support and what they wouldn't support. And in fact, there were so many voices in play and so many opinions that were being pushed around that it's something of a miracle that any proposed amendment survived the process of Article 5 at all. And the fact that 3 actually got ratified is beyond comprehension. In fact, I'm certain that it's beyond comprehension, which is why I currently support efforts like the Quill Project to help us understand what occurred, what kind of arguments were actually successful, and why certain texts were placed into these amendments and why certain texts were actually excluded. Now, in the time that I have remaining, and in the spirit of just setting the stage, I just want to talk about 2 aspects of this project and 2 aspects of this extraordinary national conversation. I want to talk about Republican constitutional theory that led up to the Civil War and informed Republicans after the Civil War. And I want to talk about the passage of the 13th Amendment, the amendment that got the ball rolling and eventually led to two additional amendments. So let's start with Republican theory. And I want to do so by starting at the beginning of the Quill Project's new collection that you're going to learn a little bit more about in a moment. The collection begins in 1860, right at the threshold of the Civil War. And they titled this opening section, The Road to Civil War. And notice what they do. The collection doesn't start at 1864. When you begin the debates on the 13th Amendment, it starts before then. It starts actually as the states were beginning to secede from the Union. And that makes this collection's entry point, its opening story, a story about the infamous Corwin Amendment. For those of you who do not know, and you should know, the Corwin Amendment was the first proposed 13th Amendment. And that first proposed 13th Amendment didn't abolish slavery. That amendment would have guaranteed states the right to maintain chattel slavery. Now, you might think that a proposed constitutional amendment protecting slavery is an odd place to begin a story about freedom and liberty. I think it's actually a perfect place to begin that story of constitutional reconstruction. Understanding this first pro-slavery 13th Amendment reveals the nature of Republican constitutional theory at the doorstep to the Civil War. And once you understand that theory, you understand everything that happens next. So let's take a look at the Corwin Amendment, drafted by Thomas Corwin. I know I should have a PowerPoint. I really should. I'm usually really good about that, but I'm not having that right now. So be attentive, be attentive. Here's the language of the Corwin Amendment. No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state. Congress passed the Corwin Amendment soon after Lincoln's election in 1860, and it was part of an effort to convince the slaveholding states not to secede from the Union. The amendment actually went to the states for ratification in March 1861, and a number of states actually ratified this amendment before the Civil War broke out. But once that happened, it rendered the entire effort moot. Now, my students, when I teach my seminar on the Reconstruction Amendments, they're generally shocked to learn how close the country came to ratifying a pro-slavery 13th Amendment. They're even more surprised to find out that the newly elected President Abraham Lincoln declared that he had no problem with an amendment that constitutionalized the rights of the states to decide the issue of slavery for themselves. And how can that be possible? How could Republicans possibly support such an amendment? And how could they so drastically change their position only 3 years later? The answer can be found by studying the nature of the original Constitution and the role of constitutional federalism in the northern states. As historian Sean Wilentz points out in his book, No Property in Man, in the years following the Revolution, the newly independent states immediately divided over whether to maintain or abolish the colonial practice of chattel slavery. Northern states moved towards abolition, while southern states maintained the earlier colonial practice. That regional divide over slavery became national policy when Congress passed the 1787 Ordinance for the Northwest Territory. In language originally drafted by Thomas Jefferson, the ordinance declared that, quote, "There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory, otherwise than in punishment of crimes whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted." That passage ultimately found its way into Section 1 of the 13th Amendment. And there's a specific reason why it did, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The 1820 Compromise, Missouri Compromise, continued this north-south divide by prohibiting Congress from admitting a slave state into the Union north of the 3630 parallel. Together, the Northwest Ordinance and the Missouri Compromise guaranteed abolition in the northern states and slavery in the southern states. And the Federalist 10th Amendment guaranteed the right of all of these states to decide for themselves what to do about the issue of slavery. Now, to the most radical of abolitionists, the fact that the Federalist Constitution allowed slavery in the southern states rendered the Constitution, in their opinion, to be an unacceptable deal with the devil. More moderate abolitionists, on the other hand, embraced constitutional federalism as a mechanism for advancing the cause of freedom. Although federalism allowed slavery in the South, it also guaranteed the rights of the northern states to embrace abolition. And northern free states used their federalist freedom to enact personal liberty laws that prohibited state officials from enforcing the Fugitive Slave Acts. They passed laws which conferred the status of citizenship on their Black residents. And they protected the due process rights of their northern Black citizens. The southern states opposed all of this. They objected to northern states' efforts to resist slavery, and they denied that any state could confer the rights of national citizenship on Black Americans. And in Dred Scott against Sanford, the Supreme Court agreed with the southern states. According to Chief Justice Taney, the discriminatory treatment of Black Americans at the time of the founding suggested that the framers of the Constitution never intended to allow for the possibility of Black American citizenship. Nor could the federal government prohibit slave owners from carrying their so-called property into the territories. Taney's opinion was not only anti-Black, it was also anti-federalism. Dred Scott denied that northern states had the power to bestow the rights of citizenship on their own Black residents. The new Republican Party loudly objected to Dred Scott. As far as Republicans were concerned, the Constitution was neither anti-Black nor anti-federalism. Republicans insisted that northern states remained constitutionally free to abolish slavery, confer citizenship on their Black residents, and the federal government had full power to abolish slavery in the territories. And it was this constitutional theory that prevailed in the presidential election of 1860. Lincoln and the incoming Republican administration would respect the right of southern states to maintain slavery, but they would also respect the right of northern states to pursue abolition. And they insisted that the federal government had the full power to ban slavery in the territories. Such policies, of course, were unacceptable to the slaveholding states. So when Lincoln and the Republicans won the election, states like South Carolina decided to secede, and they called on other states to join them in secession. It was in response to that secessionist movement that Congress passed the Corwin Amendment. Let's listen to that amendment again. Quote, "No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state." The Corwin Amendment left the issue to the states. And this is Republican constitutional theory in a nutshell. Federalism allows each state to decide whether or not to embrace slavery or abolition. And notice that the amendment says nothing about congressional power to abolish slavery in the territories. Lincoln did not oppose this amendment because he recognized it was nothing more than a restatement of Republican theory. The slaveholding states also recognized it as Republican theory, and they rejected it, and they decided to secede anyway. The Congress that remained was dominated by Republicans, and it was guided by Republican constitutional principles. And it was this Republican Congress that ultimately passed the 13th Amendment. Now, just briefly, let's talk about that amendment. I imagine that many of you already know kind of the basic outlines of the 13th Amendment. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery behind enemy lines, but it left slavery untouched in the loyal border states. It was also unclear whether or not the proclamation would continue to operate when the war ended. Persons freed by the Emancipation Proclamation faced the prospect of being returned to their former masters as only temporarily confiscated property. Before the war, Republicans had been willing to allow slavery to exist and hopefully die in the southern states, but secession and a bloody civil war convinced them that the institution of slavery was not just a moral evil, it was unacceptably destabilizing to constitutional government. Slavery was not an indelible part of the Constitution. Slavery had torn the Constitution apart. Republicans concluded that even if federalism should be preserved, slavery must be abolished throughout the Union, and they got to work immediately. They abolished slavery in the District of Columbia, a territory where they had control. They abolished slavery in the territories across the United States. In the opinion by Justice Tanya and Dred Scott, to the contrary, be damned. They also wanted to permanently end slavery in the states, but that was something currently beyond their power. To abolish slavery in the states would require a constitutional amendment. And at the time, it was not clear that such an amendment would pass. However much slavery might be associated with the rebellious South, it was simply true that loyal border states still maintained slavery. And Northern Democrats continued to press the argument that it would be unconstitutional to remove slavery from an option among the states. According to the Democrats, we had a pro-slavery constitution, and it was beyond the authority of Congress to propose an amendment that would take it out of the Constitution. So Republicans were faced with having to convince a supermajority of their colleagues and of the ratifying public, and convince them that abolishing slavery was not only constitutional, but it also advanced the hopes and the desires of the nation's original founders. To help them make this argument, Republicans drafted the 13th Amendment so that it echoed the words of Thomas Jefferson in the 1787 Northwest Ordinance. Quoting the ordinance almost verbatim, this new proposed amendment declared that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. By basing their amendment on the famous language of Jefferson's ordinance, Republicans signaled to the country that opposition to slavery was rooted in the ideas and actions of the nation's founders and in the country's founding documents. Democrats themselves continued to oppose the particular amendment, and at that point in 1864, they continued to have the numbers to allow them to defeat the original proposed 13th Amendment. When the House voted on June 15, 1864, although a majority of the House of Representatives supported the 13th Amendment, it simply did not reach the two-thirds majority, and it failed. Whether there would be a second attempt now depended on the results of the 1864 presidential election, an election that as of that June did not look particularly hopeful for Lincoln and the Republicans. The Union military campaign had stalled, and the country was growing weary of an astonishingly bloody civil war. Democratic presidential candidate and former general of the Union Army, George McClellan, promised a quick and honorably negotiated end to the Civil War, and Lincoln himself predicted that McClellan was going to win. Once again, we have to face the fact of contingency, the possibility that none of this might have happened. Today, we see a straight line from the Emancipation Proclamation to the Gettysburg Address to the defeat of the Confederacy to the 13th Amendment and so on. But someone standing on the ground at the time would have seen something completely different. Northern Republicans in the fall of 1864 saw an unenforceable Emancipation Proclamation, an obviously weary Abraham Lincoln, no clear path to military or electoral victory, and a defeated proposed 13th Amendment. Appreciating the contingency of this particular moment allows us to better appreciate the remarkable efforts of those who, even though they were surrounded by defeat, nevertheless continued to fight for abolition, some giving the last full measure of their devotion. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation opened the door to military service for free Black Americans. Many of those Black soldiers were with General Tecumseh Sherman when on September 6th, 1864, the Union Army defeated the Confederate forces at Atlanta, Georgia. That victory reignited the Republican prospects in the coming election. The Republicans had run on a platform promising military victory and an amendment abolishing slavery. When Lincoln and the Republicans prevailed, the Union cause and the Abolition Amendment got a second chance. Lincoln convinced the House Republicans to immediately hold a second vote on the Abolition Amendment and not leave the issue to the next Congress, which was months away from being called into session. That, of course, raises the question, why would Lincoln or anyone else think that a second vote by the exact same group of people would have any different result? According to director Steven Spielberg, in his otherwise magnificent movie, Lincoln and his administration believed that they could bribe enough Democrats to switch their vote. The movie is wonderful, but it makes cynicism and filthy lucre the hero of the 13th Amendment, and not the heroic Black soldiers who secured victory in Atlanta and who pricked the conscience of the nation, and the voters of 1864 who chose freedom over slavery. Spielberg also ignores the fact that since Congress's first vote, the border states had begun to abolish slavery on their own initiative. It was not bribery that turned the tide towards abolition. It was the efforts of individual Americans, Black and white, who turned the country decisively away from slavery. And even the Democrats understood this. As Missouri Democrat James Rawlins put it, quote, he had voted against the 13th Amendment the prior summer, and those same views had subsequently led him to oppose Lincoln in the election. But thinking about the matter now, he was inclined to doubt whether, under all the circumstances, the people have not at last acted more wisely than I did. Rawlins declared that he was going to change his vote, and he would now support the abolition that the country itself had turned to favor. On January 31st, 1865, the House held a second vote on the 13th Amendment, and this time the proposal passed on a vote of 119 to 56, 2 more votes than was needed for passage. So please turn in your books to page 531 of the Congressional Globe, 38th Congress, second session. This page records the actual events in the House of Representatives at the exact moment the clerk announced the passage of the 13th Amendment. This is how it is written in the official record. Quote, the announcement of passage was received by the House and by the spectators with an outburst of enthusiasm. The members on the Republican side of the House instantly sprung to their feet and, regardless of parliamentary rules, applauded with cheers and clapping of hands. The example was followed by the male spectators in the galleries, whose members included Frederick Douglass's son. They were crowded to excess, and they waved their hats and cheered loud and long, while the ladies, hundreds of whom were present, rose in their seats, waved their handkerchiefs, and participated in, and added to, the general excitement and intense interest of the scene. This lasted for several minutes. That is my favorite passage in the entire Congressional Globe. And I believe Americans should read it every year on January 31st, followed by fireworks, public toasts, and the reading of the roster of the Black Soldier 54th Massachusetts Regiment. It is one of the greatest moments in American history, and it almost didn't happen. But once it did, it changed everything. There had been a hope that passing abolition and abolishing slavery would create a situation in which Black Americans throughout the country would automatically become citizens of the United States. And there wouldn't be any need to pass additional amendments or pass additional legislation. By 1865, however, it was clear that the South had no intention of recognizing Black citizenship, and instead they passed the Black Codes. The Black Codes, which severely restricted equal civil rights for Black Americans, and in many cases left them open to arrest and being sold out as forced labor. It was going to take more than the 13th Amendment, but the country now knew how to do it. The country had now become a country which amended its constitution. And if the South wasn't ready to recognize Black citizenship, then we would constitutionalize Black citizenship. And we'd pass a 14th Amendment that in its opening lines would declare that any person born or naturalized in the United States was a citizen of the United States. Oh, and by the way, and of the state in which they reside. And if that wasn't enough to secure the development of Black citizenship and equal rights, then they would do more. We would pass a 15th Amendment, one that would guarantee the right to vote regardless of race. These all came about because we overcame the hurdle presented by the 13th Amendment and the idea that the people had in their hands the ability to change the Constitution in the direction of freedom. That is what we celebrate today, and that is what is presented to our gaze in the incredible work of the Quill Project, a project that lets us not only study, but actually see these events as they occurred. It's an honor to be able to introduce them, and I look forward to hearing more about the project. Thank you.
All right. I know some students have to excuse themselves, so now's a good time. But we do have time just to take a couple questions for Professor Lash. So we've got microphones so our folks online can hear them. Questions for Professor Lash? Anybody want to? Okay, here's one. All right.
Professor, you mentioned that Elizabeth, Katie, Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony were factors in almost derailing the 13th Amendment. Did I get that right? Could you talk a little bit about that?
One of the more controversial things that I just said very quickly, hoping to get away with it, was the possibility of failure of all of these amendments. Not everyone in the country was in favor of changing the Constitution. And we're not just talking about opposition in the South, although we are talking about opposition in the South. There were also elements in the North who were resisting constitutional change. I talked about some of that in terms of the 13th Amendment. But when it came time to think about Black suffrage and whether or not to give the freedmen the right to vote, opposition actually came in substantial form from elements in the North and not in the South. By the time you get to 1869 and 1870, actually there'd been Black suffrage registration for Black Americans in the South under the Reconstruction Acts. In order to give Black Americans in the South the opportunity to vote on the proposed 14th Amendment, the Reconstruction Acts directed the Union Army to register Black Americans to vote, give them an opportunity to vote on new governments, and then allow those new governments to decide whether or not they wanted to ratify the 14th Amendment. And they did. Black Americans in the South not only voted for new governments and in favor of the 14th Amendment, they also elected themselves into office. And you have, by the time you get to 1870, you have South Carolina, remember the state that started the Civil War? You have South Carolina now with a majority Black legislature that was more than happy to ratify not only the 14th Amendment, but also a 15th Amendment, which prohibited racial discrimination in voting. So that's happening in the South. In the meantime, the women's rights movement in the North had participated in the effort to abolish slavery. And so Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony had encouraged members of the equal rights movement and the women's rights movement to support the abolition of slavery. But their hope had been, once the attention turned to the 14th Amendment and the idea that civil rights now were going to be extended to everyone throughout the South and even throughout the North. They had hoped that that extension of civil rights was also going to include the right of women to vote. And they began to turn all of their efforts towards women's suffrage, as opposed to securing civil rights, Black civil rights in the South. They didn't get the right to vote in the 14th Amendment. So when the conversation went further and now began to look like there was going to be a suffrage amendment in the 15th Amendment that was only going to ban racial discrimination, but not guarantee women the right to vote, they decided to come out in opposition. And they came out forcefully and in racist language, denounced the idea of giving the right to vote to ignorant Blacks as opposed to educated white women. It's one of the most unfortunate moments and startling moments throughout that entire history, because these were people who had been so supportive of freedom, now ended up fracturing the whole civil rights movement throughout the South. Part of the collection that I just published includes the articles that were being published by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony at that time in the Revolution, their newspaper. And one of the more remarkable scenes that occurs at this time is that Frederick Douglass, who had been working with the women's rights movement, he was there, right, at Seneca Falls, calling for women's right to vote and equal rights long before the Civil War. He was still working alongside of them, but now he was having to appear on a stage, calling for the vote for the freedmen in the South, but he had to sit there while Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were denouncing ignorant Blacks. It really is a startling moment, but Douglass just didn't bat an eye. When it was his turn to speak, he thanked everyone for being there. He said he supported women's right to vote, but he said, listen, in terms of need, right now, the right to vote for Black Americans is a matter of life and death. And so I will continue to support the 15th Amendment, but I also will continue to support universal suffrage going down the road. So it's a hard part of the history, but it's part of the history that needs to be told. Thank you.
For the sake of time, I know we had a question here, and we definitely want to take a question from our high school students, but maybe we can do that between the break. So we're going to transition over real quick. And just as a personal side, when working with Kiana and Erica in the National Archives, they knew exactly what they were looking for. I had no idea what I was looking for. And so they just sent me on a what was a wild goose chase. But on that wild goose chase, it was an incredible moment I was flipping through the record. And it goes chronologically, and so I know what hadn't happened before I came to and held in my hands the first rendition of the 13th Amendment, which it was an emotional moment for me because that was the beginning of the end of this ugliest chapter in our nation's history. But then it doesn't stop there; kept going forward, and found early renditions of the 15th Amendment, which included one. Where early proposed amendments where a little caret was added after race, and it said, or sex, or age for our young voters or aspiring young voters. So it was so darn close, but another 50 years. Thank you, Professor Lash.